I've been praying for you this week. Just wanted you to know that. I pray for you every week, of course, but particularly I've just been giving thanks for you this week. I just want you to know I love you. And I was just, this week, thank you, God, that I get to do life with such an amazing group of people who love God and want to love Him more and want to learn how to serve people better. It's an amazing thing to be able to live together and to live together for such a purpose. So just want you to know you're being prayed for and that you're being lifted up, and I am giving thanks for every one of you. Open your Bibles, Exodus chapter 13. Just so you know, we had our first Sabbath school graduation today, like ever. It was pretty cool. So a lot of kids have moved up, and we had a video prepared to show you celebrating that today, but we had some technical difficulties, so we're going to show that next week. So I hope you're with us next week. We're going to celebrate the big graduation of our young people from one class to the next. It's going to be awesome. The kids, our word of the day today is tight. You count how many times you hear me say the word tight. Put it on a piece of paper. Count how many times I say it. Take it to the back afterwards. We'll have something for you. Listen to this. 9-year-old Joey. He was having Sabbath lunch with his parents, and Mom said, "Hey, what did you learn in Sabbath school today, Joey?" He said, "It was the most amazing story, Mom. Teacher told us a story about Moses, how he went behind enemy lines and into Egypt, and how he, rescued all of the people out of Egypt. And then they got to the Red Sea, and how Moses built this pontoon bridge across the Red Sea, and all the people walked across to safety. And then Moses used his walkie-talkie to call headquarters, and he radioed in a bomb drop, and these bombers came in, and they blew the bridge up, and everybody, was safe. And it was a great story, Mom." And Mom knew the Sabbath school teacher, and so said, "Joey, is that really what you learned in Sabbath school today?" And that's when Joey fessed up. He said, "Well, Mom, if I told you the story the way my teacher told it, you'd never believe it." Today we come to the central story of deliverance in all of the Old Testament, and it still has so much to say to us today, living 3,500 years later. And we've been studying the life of Moses this summer, and we've been asking ourselves, how can we develop the kind of intimate relationship with God that Moses had? And one of the things we've seen this summer is that it didn't come naturally or easily for Moses. And if you want to have a deep and intimate relationship with God, it's usually going to come the way it came for Moses, through a series of hard choices and difficult circumstances and even painful experiences. And today's going to be no different for Moses. And let me just say, if you really want to develop a deeper and more intimate relationship with God, and I believe you do, and I hope you pay attention to the lessons we learned from Moses' experience today. Today we see that it's the tight places of our lives that provide a tremendous opportunity for us to grow in our connection with Christ. So let's pick up where we left off last week in the story. If you remember, the angel of death had just visited Egypt, and the firstborn of Egypt had all been slain, and all of the Hebrews had been spared because they put the blood of the Passover lamb on the doorposts of their homes. And Pharaoh, in grief and despair, finally releases the Hebrews. And just pick up with me in the story in Exodus chapter 13, beginning in verse 17. It says, "When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt armed for battle." Verse 20. "After leaving Succoth, they camped at Etham on the edge of the desert. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea directly opposite Baal-Zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. And I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites did this. So what we're seeing is that the Israelites are going to find themselves in a really tight spot between the Red Sea and Egypt, between a rock and a hard place. Lots of different ways you could say it. So the question today for us is what can we learn from the tight places of our lives? And our first point is right here in this passage we just read. And that point is this: God will often lead us into tight places. I mean, the Hebrews are going to find themselves in this helpless, seemingly hopeless situation. And it couldn't be more clear that God was the one who led them there. I mean, it's very clear in the text. Verse 21, we read that God was leading them visibly with a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. That wherever that pillar would go, they would go. It says that that pillar would never leave from being in front of the people. All they had to do was watch the pillar and follow it. God was leading them step by step. And more than that, verse 17 told us that God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. So God is leading them on this journey. And just take a look at this map. You can kind of get a sense of what was going on there. That starting Black Point is probably where they took off from. That top purple line would have been the route to the Promised Land. It's a direct route, no mountains in the way, nothing. It's just a easy, smooth sailing, about 160, 180 miles, just direct shot. And so they probably started on that and got camped up around the word about there, 200 miles away, when all of a sudden the pillar of fire moves and takes them back southwest toward the western shore of the Red Sea, right into a trap. So the question begs to be asked, why? Why didn't God just take them right to the Promised Land? Why does he send them that way and then bring them back and then put them in this predicament, this tight spot? Why would he do this to them? And the passage gives us a couple of answers. And the first thing we see from the passage is that God will often lead us into tight places because he knows more than we do. And he knows exactly what we need. Verse 17 says, God was afraid that if they went the direct route through the Philistine country, that they would face war and then run scared. Right? That they would encounter a battle and be like, we're heading back to Egypt. That they would return, they would make an about face, and they would go back to what they were comfortable with, even though that comfort of the known was bondage and slavery. And I just want to say a word here to maybe some of our new converts. Maybe you're young in the faith. And I hope we all see that this story we've been studying of the Exodus, while it happened in history, and it really is a historical event, it's also really a metaphor for our spiritual lives. Just as Pharaoh is trying to keep the people of God in slavery, that we have a very real Pharaoh named the devil who wants to keep us in slavery to sin. And just as Moses went to Pharaoh and continually said to him, let my people go, Christ comes and says, let my people go. And he will stop at nothing to set his people free. And more than just being Moses, Christ is also the Passover lamb, the one who gave himself and gave his blood so that we could be free from the stain and the bondage of sin. And just as God is, these people are leaving the Egypt and going to the Promised Land, this is a metaphor for kind of beginning our lives, beginning our journey with Christ after we've left the bondage of sin and accepted Christ. After we put his blood on the doorposts of our hearts. Those first months and those first years are kind of that experience of wandering out from Egypt. And so, just as God is concerned for the Israelites in this story, that they would turn back to Egypt, I believe he is concerned with his new converts today as well. He's concerned for you if you're young in the faith because he knows what lies ahead of you. And he knows stuff that you don't know. And he knows what would just make you crumble at the knees and want to turn back to your old life. And so oftentimes he will lead us into tight places because he knows more than we do. So maybe that loss of your job that you thought was the most devastating thing that ever happened, that could have been God leading you into a tight place so that you would have to rely on him in the midst of that predicament. and grow your faith. Maybe the loss of that relationship, that boyfriend, that girlfriend that, was your world. And then all of a sudden, the relationship is over, and you think your world is over. Could that have been God leading you into a tight place because he knew that person would have led you down the wrong road and away from a relationship with him? Or even that health problem. Like maybe could God have led you to a tight place because he knew you needed to be in a place of complete dependence on him for your health? Because here's the thing, the most important thing from God's perspective isn't my comfort, it isn't my happiness. The most important thing for God isn't even a long life for me. Those might be like the top of my priority list, but not for God. For God, the most important things on his priority list are that I be in a relationship with him both now and for eternity. And so I can imagine God looking at the tight place of that little nook in the Red Sea where the Israelites would be trapped, and he said, oh, that's perfect. I can use this. The first reason God led his people into a tight place is because he knew the alternative would send them running back to slavery. But there was more. According to chapter 14, verse 3, God wanted them to look like fools so that Pharaoh would look at them and say, they're clueless, and that he could show his power and glory. Can you imagine that God would want you to follow him in such a way that you would look foolish? I mean, the route that they took made absolutely no sense. I mean, in human judgment, it was completely foolish. I mean, again, just look at the map. I mean, they started to head in the right direction, and they come back southwest, and I mean, they're clearly they don't know where they're going. And this is the worst military move possible. Pharaoh would look at what they were doing and say, yeah, they're clueless. They're lost. They're fools. They're fools. It's going to be easy pickings. Let's just go out and bring them back. But it was all according to God's plan. Have you ever thought following God might make you look like a fool? We don't like looking foolish. I know I don't like looking foolish. I like looking smart and like I know what I'm doing and I know the plan and, I'm not just aimlessly wandering. But when following God leads us to look like fools, we've got to be willing to follow, even though we look foolish. Because we never know what God might be up to or how he's planning to work through our foolishness. Listen, God will lead you into tight places. He did it to his son Jesus right after his baptism. Led him by the Spirit into the wilderness where he could be tempted for 40 days by the tempter. And he will do the same thing for you, beloved of God. He will lead you into tight places. Belonging to Christ does not exempt us from the tight, hard places of life. It doesn't exempt us from suffering. And that's a rude wake-up call for a lot of new converts. And sometimes it seems like it would just be easier to go back and serve Pharaoh than it would be to remain on a journey with this God who leads us in tight places. But the reality is he has so much more in store for us, not only on the journey, but as we get to the promised land as well. Well, Pharaoh sees the Hebrews wandering in the desert, and he falls for the trap. He changes his mind. He thinks to himself, what have I done? We've let the foundation of our economy go. All these slaves, our entire workforce, we've got to go and get them back. And so he gets all the best chariots and all of his best horsemen and all of his best soldiers, and he goes after them and he pursues them and he catches up with them at a place called Baal Zephon. And we pick up the story in verse 10 of chapter 14. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us up to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone? Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. Moses answered the people, do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Our second lesson. Tight places will often reveal and expose the contents of our hearts. Listen, no doubt about it, the Hebrews were in a tight place. I mean, they were hemmed in. On the east side, they were hemmed in by the sea. On the south side, they were hemmed in by a rugged mountain. On the west, they were hemmed in by a mountainous desert. On the north, by the Egyptian army. I mean, they saw that escape was impossible, that they were in apparently a hopeless situation, and that tight spot revealed the contents of their hearts just the way it does for us. It's what reveals to us, what are we made of? Do we have faith in God the way we say we do? I mean, it's the tight places of our lives that really demonstrate what I believe. The Israelites responded to this tight place the same way we often do. First, they cry out to God. And I think this is commendable, because they were in a place where they should be crying out to God. But it's the kind of thing you can almost read over. It's the end of, I think, verse 10, where it says, and the Israelites were terrified and they cried out to God. All right. It's like what we do in that moment of complete terror and desperation. You know, the car's coming careening for us. We're ready for a head-on accident, or the guy pulls the gun out at the store, or the doctor brings the test results. And it's just that moment of sheer terror when we're just like instinctively we cry out to God, God, help me, save me, deliver me, spare me. So good for the Hebrews for crying out to the Lord in their moment of desperation. But the majority of the passage documents quite a different response. In fear, they turn to their leader and they start just complaining, and they seem to just lose all hope and all perspective. Why did you take us out of Egypt? Didn't we tell you while we were there, just leave us alone? We wanted to stay there. We didn't want to leave in the first place. You drug us out here. I mean, were there no graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to die? Would be better to be slaves in Egypt than to die here. And I find it funny that they jump to the absolute worst conclusion. We're going to die, right? I don't even think the Egyptians were coming to kill them. They were just coming to bring them back into slavery where they wanted to be anyway. But we so often do that. You know, when we get into a tight spot, you know, we're just like instantly jump to the worst possible conclusions. We're all going to die. And that's the way they reacted. And we instinctively cry out for relief just like they do. I mean, it's this pattern. We cry for relief. God, save me. And then when the relief doesn't come instantly, when my tight space isn't resolved, you know, automatically or quickly, then we resort to jumping to the worst conclusions. We let the circumstances around us let us melt us with fear. We come to the place where we lose hope. We let the circumstances around us just take our eyes off of the Lord. And that's what was happening for the Hebrews. I mean, they took their eyes off of the Lord and put them on the Egyptian army, and that's where they lost hope and focus. This tight place didn't just expose the hearts of the Hebrews. It also exposed Moses' heart. Moses clearly has grown. We could see this. He's been walking with God a while now. He's been in a couple tight spots. And he has seen what God has done. He's seen God's heart. He's seen God's power. He's seen God's faithfulness in other circumstances. And so he's learning to trust God. He knew God's power. He knew God's heart. And so he responds to the situation very differently than the Hebrews. He responds with faith. He tells the people, do not be afraid. Can you imagine being one of the Hebrews, having your leader stand up in front of you? Don't be afraid. What, are you nuts? Do you see that big cloud of dust from the Egyptian soldiers and the horses? And do you see that they were pinned in here by the sea? Don't be afraid. I mean, what are you smoking, Moses? And he tells them, no. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. And then in perhaps the most powerful and profound words in all of the Bible, in verse 14, Moses says, the Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Man, if you're in a tight spot right now, just drink those words in. Just let those saturate your soul, because the same God who was fighting for them wants to fight for you. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Man, what courage in the face of overwhelming circumstances. What faith. I mean, what leadership. Moses knew God is up to something here. He knew God had a plan. He remembered all that God had done for them in the past, and he was confident God would act for them today. He didn't know how, he didn't know when, but Moses trusted God. And it is in the tight places of our lives that our hearts are exposed. What are we made of? Will we melt with fear, or will we stand in faith? This week, I was able to connect with an old friend over lunch. I'd heard that Greg had been working in the Parker area, hadn't seen him in a couple years, but a mutual friend said, "Hey, Greg Smith says he knows you." So we planned to get together for lunch this week, and then I heard the rest of the story from our mutual friend. Greg is the manager of a large building in Parker, and he was in a tight spot. His employer was putting pressure on him to go against his convictions and break one of the 10 Commandments. Greg is a Seventh-day Adventist Christian and believes the fourth commandment that says, don't work on Sabbath, if at all possible. Don't work on Sabbath. And so his employer was starting to ask him to work on Sabbaths, although he told him ahead of time he wouldn't do that. He said, hey, I'll come in if it's an emergency, but other than that, I'm sorry, but that would be going against my convictions. I can't do that. Now picture yourself in that tight spot. You know, you've got a mortgage, you've got a wife, you've got kids. They're looking to you. You're the provider of the family. You know how hard it is to find a job in this economy, right? And at the same time, you believe God is good and he is holy, and you want to do what he asks you to do because you love him, and you believe he's not going to ask you to do anything other than what is going to enhance your relationship with him and give you a deeper sense of satisfaction in life. And so what do you do in that tight spot? When your employer is telling you one thing and God is asking you to do another. I think most of us would probably say, well, hey, I'm going to do what God tells me to do every time. And I admire that about you. But really, how easy is that to say when you are looking unemployment in the face? So I heard all of this before my lunch with Greg. And I also heard that because of Greg's stand and his convictions that he had been asked to leave the job and he was being transitioned out. And he was in the midst of that transition, and he didn't really know where he was going to be going or what he was going to be doing from here. And so as I prepared to meet with him for lunch this week, I was getting ready to come in to this lunch and be a source of encouragement. I was ready to hear those standard questions. Well, where was God? I mean, why did God let this happen to me? And those questions that come to us in such times. I was prepared to bolster my friend's faith. But what actually ended up happening was he ended up bolstering mine. As I looked across the table at Greg, there was no bitterness, no fear, no resentment, no remorse, no regret. He told me that through all the struggles with his employer, he knew that God had him exactly where he wanted him to be for a purpose. And he talked about during his time at working for this company how he had multiple opportunities to share Christ with people, to pray for people, to bless people, to serve people. He said at one point in the process, his supervisor came to him and said, listen, we really want to keep you, and we're prepared to offer you incentives to work just a couple Saturdays. And Greg respectfully replied, are you able to offer me eternal life? Because that is what God has already given me. I'm like, you may not like that response, but it's exposing the contents of his heart. But what really blew me away was what happened when his supervisor finally contacted him to put together an exit strategy. What she was doing is she was firing him, saying, we've got to figure out how we're going to move you out in the next few weeks. And then she said, but my mom's in the hospital, and so we can't work on it now. But in a few days, I'll be back in the office, and we'll put together the rest of your exit strategy. And Greg saw an opportunity to serve. And he told her he was so sorry that her mother was in the hospital and suffering, and he said, would it be okay if I prayed for you and your mother? And this woman was silent. I imagine she was probably thinking, I just fired this guy, and he's offering to pray for me and my mother. But he took the silence as an opportunity, and he began to pray a prayer of blessing over this woman and her mother, that they would be well and experience all of God's blessings. And he says again, that's why I was there. I was there to be present, or to present Christ in a redemptive way to people who needed to experience his love. Without a doubt, the tight places of our lives expose the contents of our hearts. And so I just ask you, what are your tight places revealing about you? Tight places, point number 3, tight places allow God to demonstrate his power and his faithfulness. Let's pick the story up again in verse 15. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long. When Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He made the wheels of their chariots come off so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. So this passage begins with this interchange between God and Moses, and God says, why are you crying out to me? Apparently Moses had been crying out to God, which seems to me to be pretty appropriate for a guy in Moses' position. But this tells us that there is a time to pray and there is a time to act, right? A lot of times we're in a tight spot and we just keep praying, God, do something, God, do something, God, do something. And he says, I want to do something for you, but you got to take the first step, right? You got to do something here for me. I'm asking you to do this. And that's what he says to Moses. He says, all right, stop crying out to me. Now do what I tell you to do. Raise your staff and stretch it out over the sea to divide the water so the Israelites can go through on dry ground. With this one act, I will not only deliver you, but I will destroy your enemies forever. And here's what really gets me about this particular situation, is that God had a solution in mind to their tight place that never would have occurred to Moses. Never would have occurred to me. I mean, you put me in this situation, or a lot of you, I'm going to pull, some of the brightest, wisest strategists together, and we're going to be like, all right, let's look at our strengths and our weaknesses. What are our options? What can we do here? How can we get out of this? Let's figure it out. Well, we could raise the white flag, and we could, try to surrender, see if they'll take us peacefully, or we can mobilize everybody into an army and maybe we can outnumber them, or maybe if everyone just scatters into the desert and the mountains, at least some of our people will get away, or we could just swim for it. We could try that. I mean, but that's all I got. I can't think of anything else. I can't think of any way out of this predicament other than those things. And what God had in mind never would have occurred to me. I don't know about you. Maybe if you read the story. But they hadn't read the story. But God, through his prophet Moses, he gives a solution, and it is completely different from anything in the human perspective. It's like God is saying, Moses, I'm going to do something that has never been done before. Okay? And when I do this, it's never going to have occurred to you, and it's going to let you know you're not running the show. All right? You're not in control. I'm in control. All right? I am the one. I am God. And I want you to see my power and my faithfulness. Because if I put you in a situation, Moses, that you could figure out, you would be tempted to take all the glory once you got out of it. But I put you in a spot you couldn't get out of, and I'm going to get you out of it in a way that you never would have thought of, so that you will see that I am God, and I am good, and I am faithful, and I am powerful, and I will fight for you. And the rod is lifted, and the sea parts, and the Hebrews pass through on dry land, and the Egyptians pursue, and they're thrown into confusion. They even realize that they're fighting against God, and eventually they're drowned as the walls of the sea come crushing down. What an incredible deliverance. And in the same way, God wants to show his faithfulness and his power in the tight places of our lives. That's one of the reasons he leads us into the tight places. It's often going to be so that he can deliver you in ways you never imagined possible, so that you'll know it wasn't you, but it was him. And again, you may list out all of your options the way I do, but God may just come in and deliver you in a way you never would have thought of, so that, again, the glory goes to the right place. But that's one of the reasons he'll lead you into those tight places, to demonstrate his power and his glory. And you may think, you know what, God doesn't work like that anymore. Really? And yeah, he's not parting any seas recently, but he still works just as faithfully and just as powerfully. Maybe you've heard the story of Gladys Aylward. She was an English missionary in China beginning in 1932. Ingrid Bergman played her in the movie made on her life called The Inn of the Sixth Happiness. Great movie. Highly recommend it. But Gladys was led by God to serve orphans in China. She cared for them. She loved them. She fed them. She told them about Jesus. But she was forced to flee China in 1938 when the Japanese invaded Yangcheng. But she couldn't leave these orphans behind. And so with only one assistant, this woman leads over 100 orphans on this long, dangerous, grueling journey over this rugged mountain range to free China. So she had to survive the constant threat of being captured by the Japanese, where she would most likely be killed, as well as the orphans. She had to brave the elements. She had to provide food and water and shelter and encouragement and leadership to over 100 orphans. And in the book, The Hidden Price of Greatness, Ray Ebeson tells the following story. He says, during Gladys's harrowing journey out of war-torn Yangcheng, she grappled with despair and fear as never before. And after passing a sleepless night, she faced the morning with no hope of reaching safety. She looked at her circumstances. She looked at her situation. She said, this is impossible. Can't be done. And a 13-year-old orphan in the group reminded her of their much-loved story of Moses and the Red Sea. And Gladys, like many of us would do, cried in desperation, but I'm not Moses. And this insightful 13-year-old girl said, of course, Miss Gladys, you're not Moses, but God is still God. And when Gladys and those orphans miraculously made it through to safety, they proved once again that no matter how tight our tight place is, God is still God. And he wants to be your God. And he wants you to trust him regardless of what your tight space is. And he wants you to wait on his timing. And he wants you to wait on his plan and his deliverance. And he wants to show himself to be faithful to you by delivering you in ways you never imagined possible. Finally, tight places create intimacy and trust. Look at this last verse of the chapter, verse 31. And when the Israelites saw the great power the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, and they put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. The people, it says, because of how God delivered them from their tight place, They feared the Lord. In other words, they were awed by him. They're like, whoa, he's awesome. And they put their trust in him. And this is something that never would have happened had they taken the short route to the promised land. If they had not been in this tight place, they never would have learned the way they did to fear the Lord and to trust the Lord. And if you want to develop a relationship of intimacy and trust with God, then you have to accept the inevitability of tight places in your life. I mean, God is going to use them. Nothing will grow you more. Nothing will give God more of an opportunity to show his power and his faithfulness than in those tight places. And I got to tell you, there are times I pray for tight places for some of you. Because I love you. Because I love you. And so if you find yourself in a tight place, say, is Dave praying for me? It could be. It could be. Because there is nothing that grows us. There is nothing that brings us perspective. There is nothing that makes us depend on God more than a tight place. I've experienced this myself. A couple weeks ago, I told you the story of how Kim and I had been called into the ministry in a burning bush experience of our own in July of 1994. And we started making plans to go to school, and we were going to be going to Union College in Lincoln, Nebraska, January 3rd. The semester was going to start. I was going to be a theology student. I'm going to be a pastor. All right, let's go. But lots of stuff to take care of in the meantime, and one of which was selling a house. We had just had a brand new house built. It was about 6 months old. We had been living in this house. But now we were going to have to sell this house that we loved because as we looked at our finances and going to school and paying for living expenses in Lincoln, Nebraska, we could not keep this house and do that. So we had to sell the house. But at the time, the market was hot. I'm like, I got this. I can do this. And so we got a good realtor, and I did what I knew how to do, being in the business world and whatnot. You get a good realtor, got good marketing, you do it all. It'll come together. And so we put the house on the market in July. I was hoping the house wouldn't sell too soon because my strategy was so good. And the market was so hot. I could do this. But July came and went, and August and September, October came and went. Hardly any showings, no offers. Then comes October, November, nothing. And I began to sweat, and I began to think, man, I gotta, if I'm going to go to school, we got to be there by January 3rd, and we put this cutoff date, December 27th. That is the last day we can close, December 27th. That'll give us 5 days to get out of the house and get to Lincoln, Nebraska, get settled into our new house, set up our business before school starts, December 27th. But first week of December comes, and we still have nothing. And I begin to doubt my call. Did I really hear from God? Was that bush really on fire? Did he really call me into the ministry? I'm just not sure about this. And I'm sweating, and I just finally, second week of December, nothing. And I gave it up to God. I'm like, God, I'm in a tight spot here. I've got a lease on a place in Lincoln. I've got this going on here. I can't do both. I don't know what to do but to look to you. The second week of December, realtor called, hey, we have a showing. Yay. Young couple comes and looks at the place. They end up offering us full price. But the realtor said there's one glitch. They want to know if you can close quick. They've asked if you're able to close on December 27. And we just stood back and said, wow. And God was saying to us in that moment, you think you know what you're doing, but I will fight for you. And if I had never been backed into that tight spot, I wouldn't not only have that story to tell, but I would have been reaffirmed in this calling that he placed on my life, that I've looked back on hundreds of times when I've doubted. And I said, no. God called me twice. And God is going to call you twice, and 3 times and 4 times. He's going to put you in tight spots so that he can deliver you because he wants to show you his power. He wants to show you his faithfulness, and he wants you to learn to trust in him. Listen, the Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still.